When the Imperium of Man comes calling, its worlds answer, and if they don't, then Emperor help them. Such was the case with the world we visit today, an industrial planet who refused to contribute to the war effort in the Horus Heresy. Rather than be destroyed, however, the world was punished by being forced to do exactly what it had refused to do, contributing warriors in the aftermath to the Astra Militarum. Said warriors are proud and disdainful, wielding ornate antique weapons and specializing in urban warfare. Their world remains pretty much as it was in those ancient times, a mix of industry and habitation ruled by both Mechanicus and Imperium in tandem. As it was then, it is the industrial world known as Vostroya, and in deference to their punishment tithes, the regiments raised are known as the Vostroyan Firstborn. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to Regiments of Renown, a 40k Stories mini-series. Vostroya is classified as an industrial world, something of a hybrid between a Forge world and a Hive world located in Segmentum Obscurus to the north of Terra. In ancient times, it was a world sworn to the service of the Martian Mechanicum as opposed to the Imperium of Man, having assumedly been found by the expedition fleets sent out in the Age of Strife. Though it was allied primarily to Mars over Terra, as was typical in the Great Crusade, it served both forces, contributing material to the crusade per the orders of the Tetrarchy, a coalition of Mechanicum members and traditional imperial government. It wasn't exactly the most peaceful of places, having suffered at least 18 great wars throughout its history, and as you might expect for a world so steeped in industry, its landscape is polluted and uninhabitable in many areas. And yet, despite the high population turnover caused by said industry, all was as well as could be expected on Vostroya. That is, until the Horus Heresy reared its head. Either unaware of the schism of Mars or otherwise choosing to side with the forces loyal to the Emperor, the Tetrarchy continued their production of arms and ammo for the Imperium even as it turned on itself. However, the juggernaut that is the Emperor's domain wanted more, and it came to Vostroya demanding it contribute soldiers to the war effort. Shockingly, the Tetrarchy actually refused the demand, deciding it was better that the population be conserved in order to maintain production. Even more shockingly, the Imperium let them. Probably they thought it was just best not to push the issue and lose another potential source of material. We don't know exactly at what point in the heresy this happened, but I would wager it was relatively early in the war as a snap response to much of the Imperial army either siding with Horus or otherwise going rogue. Maybe it was even before the Schism of Mars. Hard to know. Whatever the case, in the aftermath of the heresy, the Tetrarchy had something of a change of heart on the issue. Or they had a change in membership for some reason. Given the high population turnover, I wouldn't even be that surprised. Whatever the reasons behind it, there was a strong sense of guilt amongst the Tetrarchy about not helping the Imperium in its hour of need, and to that end, a law was drafted, something of a punishment law, known as the Offering of the Firstborn. This law applies to absolutely everyone on Vostroya. No exceptions, not even amongst the Tetrarchy who wrote the thing. The offering states that the firstborn son of every single family on Vostroya must become a member of the Astra Militarum, joining one of the regiments drafted from the planet in an attempt to atone for the mistake and pay off the debt they owe the Lord of Mankind. What is less clear is whether anyone other than a firstborn son is allowed to join up. I suspect that when times get desperate, a broader draft is made, but there is no evidence of such an event. This law has stood for the past 10,000 years without deviation or failure, and it is considered of great importance to follow it and join up. You might expect, therefore, that regiments are only raised once per generation, given the usual way the Astra Militarum usually does things. But the regiments of Vostroya, known collectively as the Vostroyan Firstborn, are actually reinforced from home rather than being allowed to be wiped out and raised anew. As such, the regiments have existed for the entirety of the last 10,000 years, for the most part. As you might expect, Vostroya, as we mentioned, has suffered its fair share of invasions in the past. The 18th of those Great Wars was an Orc invasion eventually broken by the efforts of the Firstborn. However, we don't know if Great War is simply a byword for invasion or whether it includes civil unrest too. But somehow there are no records of a force of the ruinous powers invading Vostroya. Part of me is surprised by this, given the location of the planet. Being somewhere in Segmentum Obscurus, and thus relatively close to the Eye of Terror, I'd have expected the forces of Chaos to have had a crack at it at some point. Then again, it is thought to be in a place known as the Halo Zone, beyond the Eye if you're looking from Terra's perspective, and even beyond the reach of the Astronomicon. As a result, it may be that navigators have difficulty getting there, which would explain why some don't invade, but surely it would make sense for demonic forces to have a go at it and cut off a source of manpower and, presumably, material for the Imperium. Oh well, no one said Chaos was intelligent. Also, I mentioned earlier that it was something of a punishment to create the offering of the Firstborn. This punishment did not come from the Imperium directly, as it was drafted by the Tetrarchy. I'm curious if the Imperium was ever planning to create a reprisal for Vostroya. Somehow I expect they would, but then you also have to consider that the Imperium pretty much allows a planet to run itself. Hard to know, and we'll never know, unfortunately. Vostroyan Firstborn regiments are ferociously loyal, to the point that they will look down their noses at anyone they consider less devoted than themselves. They have incredibly high standards for training, and their unique recruitment style means that there are always veterans on hand to drill said standards into the new recruits. It may cause headaches for the Munitorum adepts who must get the reinforcements where they're needed, but it means that all regiments are a decent strength at all times, with at least a core of reliable seasoned warriors to back up the red shirts. And speaking of red shirts, one of the most iconic features of the Firstborn is their red greatcoat, usually accompanied by some sort of fur hat and a rather impressive moustache, which is a symbol of manhood on Vostroya. I assume the coats are red as a symbol of their ancient alliance with Mars, especially given the presence of Mechanicus members amongst the Tetrarchy. Their weaponry is archaic and ornate, and much like a family, the lasguns are passed along like heirlooms from guardsman to guardsman. In fact, the Firstborn are something of a family, a warrior brotherhood both on and off the battlefield. It might not be forged in combat in the same way as for regiments raised entirely together, but it is a bond as unbreakable as any other given their strict discipline and unflinching loyalty. The reason the weapons are passed down, for those curious, is simple galactic geography. When you live on a planet as out of the way as Vostroya, it makes it much harder for new recruits to be supplied with the newest arms and armour by the Munitorum, so having the veterans simply pass their equipment on makes a measure of sense. And who knows, maybe someone did some tinkering to something somewhere somehow to make it just that little bit better. Then again, Vostroya does produce its own lasguns, so I guess they just have an older design than most given its ornate aesthetic. Either that or the Tetrarchy just prefer it to whatever schematics they've been given down the years. Firstborn regiments are specialised in two main spheres of warfare, urban combat and winter warfare, though somehow I doubt they're on the level of the Valhallan Ice Warriors. I'm actually curious as to how these specialisms came about. Urban makes sense given the industrial nature of Vostroya, but winter combat? Well, it is said the poles of Vostroya were rather cold, so I suppose there's at least a fraction of a chance it's due to that. Surprisingly though, given these specialisms, weapons such as the Flamer, ideally suited for close or cold combat, are not the most popular special weapon of choice. That honour goes instead to the plasma gun of all things, which wouldn't admittedly be my choice in tight city streets, but if it works for them, I'm not going to question it. For heavy weapons, the preference is for the heavy bolter, which I assume is also made on Vostroya. Maybe that's why it's preferred actually, they just make it themselves so it's the most numerous weapon available. Though they've likely been very busy at home, since their homeworld may well have been invaded 18 or more times down the years, the Vostroyan Firstborn regiments have been active the galaxy over, both successfully and otherwise. Honestly, records suggest that the otherwise is more common than I think they would like, as the Firstborn have been on the wrong end of more than a few battles in their time. A more recent example was the event known simply as the Xenos War, a spillover conflict from the Titanic War in Octarius between the Orcs and the Tyranids. In one of very few confirmed cases of such a thing, a gene-stealer cult was able to survive and thrive within the Orc community on the scrap world known simply as Tactica. Very original, Orcs, very original. A force of Vostroyans attacked Tactica in an attempt to kill the planet's war boss, but they ran afoul of a mighty six-limbed gargant that, when destroyed, turned out to be packed with gene-stealers. Yeah, that did not end well for the Firstborn, I can tell you. A few centuries, or maybe millennia earlier, the other new player on the galactic stage caused the Vostroyans more than a bit of trouble, as the Tau's second sphere of expansion targeted the industrial world of Nimbosa. Led by one of the commanders to take the title of Brightsword, it is perhaps of little surprise that the Tau were victorious, able to isolate elements of the Imperial defense bit by bit, and then eventually whittling down the counterattack. As it turned out, Nimbosa ended up in Imperial hands anyway, as the Black Templars launched a crusade in the aftermath of the third sphere of expansion, but as far as we're aware, no Vostroyans were amongst that force. To be fair, even when the Vostroyan do technically win, it can be at incredible cost to their own numbers. Take the incident on Carrack Prime, for example. A Vostroyan regiment was besieged by a splinter of Hive Fleet Moloch and was absolutely doomed. However, rather than let themselves be consumed as their ammo ran out, they opened the gates to the Hive city they were defending. Once much of the Tyranid force was in the city, they incinerated the Hive and everyone in using what I assume to be nuclear weapons, meaning the rest of the splinters starved as winter covered the world. Another similar but different incident occurred on Opsis Prima, though this time it was Chaos Cultists and elements of the Iron Warriors rather than Tyranids. This time, the enemy broke through and the remainder of the Vostroyan tank regiment gathered at the main plasma reactor there, the last area still held by the Imperials. Unfortunately, despite actually having a Baneblade on their side, the enemy had demon engines, including a Lord of Skulls. Said Lord of Skulls was able to destroy the Baneblade, but the explosion of the tank then caused the reactor to crack, and though there wasn't an even bigger explosion, the air for hundreds of miles around was rendered toxic, pretty much causing the battle to end in a draw due to mutual annihilation, though since the Imperium got the world by default, it's counted as a Pyrrhic victory for which the Vostroyan tankers were honoured in death as heroes. The Firstborn have also been involved in many campaigns alongside other Imperial forces. It was a regiment of Vostroya in overall command for Astra Militarum forces on the world of Medusa 5, and alongside the Space Marines they was ultimately successful in the multiple faction war over the planet. They've also been involved in campaigns such as Pandarax, Shadowbrink, the first time, and the recent Cryptus campaign, as well as the Battle of the Solarian Gate we mentioned when we discussed the armies of Mordian. Finally, we have the agri-world of Kurkaris in a location unknown. This is one of the very few instances where Vostroyans actually employed Rough Rider cavalry, a rarity amongst the Firstborn and known as Hussars. Kurkaris has incredibly dense forests, rendering the Vostroyan tank they'd probably want to use useless, and so the Hussars and the infantry took the fight to the Orcs invading the world. It was a rather large crusade apparently, though no Space Marines were involved, and apparently the Vostroyans were instrumental in defeating the Greenskins. It's a bit of a shame we don't have many tales of great Vostroyan victories to tell, but if we can take anything away from their campaigns, it is a reinforcement of their incredible devotion and their refusal to give up. Plus, we've also no evidence of a Vostroyan force falling to chaos or otherwise turning on the Imperium, and though that's true for most if not all Regiments of Renown, it's got to be noted given the influence of the Ruinous Powers and other, less chaotic corrupting forces. The commanders of Vostroyan regiments are known as Grafs, and a few of them have won a fair amount of renown during their careers. For example, we have Lord Marshal Graf Harazan, overall commander of the Medusa 5 campaign. For those curious, Lord Marshal is an alternate title for Lord General, the highest rank attainable within the Astra Militarum's command structure unless specially assigned by the Munitorum or the High Lords of Terra. Apparently his placement in this role caused a stir as many of the other generals weren't keen on a Vostroyan in overall command. I'm assuming it's that disdainful nature. Perhaps, no surprise, given we mentioned that Vostroyans are pretty down looking at those considered less devoted, but Harazan proved himself and his capability in his prosecution of the campaign. He deployed the Guard under his command with 9 key areas in mind, simply ordering them not to retreat. And they didn't. In fact, even as Medusa 5 was lost and destroyed in the warp storm known as Van Groth's rapidity, many Imperials stayed on planet just to stop the myriad enemies from taking anything of worth. It is unclear whether Harazan stayed with them, making sure his contingent didn't break before the planet did, but as his story is yet to continue on from Medusa 5, I'm guessing he may have done. The other known Graf also bore the title of Lord Marshal, known as Tishchenko, and he was the one in command on Nimbosa in its initial defense against the Tau. We don't know much about him either as a commander or an individual, but we do know he was not the sort of man to surrender given the way he died. Despite his command squad being cut down around him, he refused to let the regimental standard fall until Brightsword personally cut him down. Such was the inspirational nature of his death and the overall Vostroyan defense, that Imbosan populace were inspired to resist the greater good, perhaps helping the Black Templars when they later came to liberate the planet, and maybe saving themselves from the Sons of Sigismund for proving their devotion to the Emperor. Interestingly, the Vostroyans have a couple of renowned tank aces despite not being particularly famous for armoured warfare. One of them dates back to the 18th of Vostroya's Great Wars, the one against the Orcs that we mentioned earlier. His name is Alexei Dimitri, who according to the other Firstborn has oil for blood, and though he wasn't a commander at the time of the 18th Great War, he was one of the most renowned aces and commanders on Vostroya. After losing his superior officer in the war, he rallied the Leman Russ squadrons to break the siege on Vostroya's capital and thus winning the overall conflict. Admittedly, being a badass with a tank under you does not a natural tank commander make, and Dimitri is a perfect example of that. He hates command, regrets his promotion, and in his own mind the only upside to the whole thing has been command of a Baneblade as opposed to a Leman Russ. He fought on the world of Ixoi during the Cryptis campaign, and though we don't know his eventual fate, the world was consumed by the Tyranids with its defenders scattered, so his odds of survival are quite low. The other Vostroyan tank ace we know is, to our knowledge at least, still alive. Astrov Yemenev was a member of the 24th Vostroyan Armoured Regiment known as the Iron Bloods, and he rose to prominence on the hive world of Degis, location unknown. Degis was being invaded by the Eldari of Craftworld Biel-Tarn, amongst whom was a fellow tank ace, Fire Prism pilot Vathwal. Unfortunately for Heavenlance, he ended up isolated from the rest of the Eldari forces, allowing Yemenev and his tank company to take him on. The problem with Leman Russ tanks against the Fire Prism ace is that said ace is going to be a nightmare to pin down, and so it proved as Heavenlance took out half of the Leman Russ tanks before long. Thankfully, Yemenev has a decent amount of common sense. If you think about it, shooting on either side of something allows you to hold it place long enough down this little corridor for you to kill it. This tactic was executed with aplomb, and thus Yemenev was victorious and destroyed Heavenlance's normally agile Fire Prism. We don't know how the battle for Degis played out, especially since Heavenlance was isolated as we mentioned earlier, but even if the invasion was a success, the work of Yemenev's company would have ultimately been a heavy blow for Eldari morale. So end the tales of the Vostroyan Firstborn. Though they likely never wanted to fight in the Emperor's armies, following the Horus Heresy, the leaders of Vostroya conscripted their descendants for the rest of time. Despite the slightly odd nature of their origins, the Vostroyan Firstborn regiments founded following this decree have proved their devotion and loyalty to the Imperium time and time again. They may not win as many fights as others, and they may not be the best known of the Regiments of Renown we will cover in these logs, but the Firstborn are worthy of incredible respect nonetheless, and I still wouldn't like to cross them on the battlefield. For now though, we must move on from Vostroya and continue our journey. Our next tale will likely be a shorter one as it is still being told today and it only began a few centuries ago, but it is a tale that must be told as it may shape the future of an entire race. For now though, I must prepare for transition back to the webway as that is the most fitting place to tell this story. Thank you all for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.